Yeah, I kind of always start these things by apologising, really. There's a kind of, you know, your success haunts you. Because, you know, people say, yeah, we really like your work. Can you say it again, please? Or, you really must be in this book, you know. And you say yes, and they say, so can you tell us something a little bit different about what you've already done? And you think, oh no. And so there's this thing. So and this is one reason why I don't need any kind of audio-visual aid or anything, because I kind of stopped using PowerPoint because I get bored if I kind of use it, really. So the talk today is going to be a kind of, I'm going to improvise around some of the themes of my work and hope that it works, because it's I turned up last night and I realised it's 1 o'clock in the morning for me. And I've never tried to talk articulately at this time of the morning ever before, so so I will try. So thanks for inviting me, and I've certainly had a lovely day today. So Vancouver, I can see why people say Vancouver. It's got the best, if not the best standard of living, the happiest people in any urban centre ever, you know. So I was walking around trying to get a happiness kind of index going with people, but it didn't work, you know. People looked vaguely miserable, you know. And apparently it was because it may be sunny, but it's cold. Okay, so mobile music and urban culture. Okay, when I got into this, I'll talk a little bit about how I got into this, because in fact I got in by accident, actually. It was only when I was halfway through my work on the Walkman that I realised I was working on sound, actually. And then I realised that, in fact, I'd read almost nothing on sound and urban studies or cultural studies or media studies. And then I realised that when I was working on the Walkman that no one really had done much on that either. And I thought, this is very strange for technology that's very popular. I started doing that work in 1992. So I've been around for 13, 14 years by then. And no one had done any empirical work on it. So I kind of thought, wouldn't that be strange if some people had done some work on it, but no empirical work? Wouldn't that be strange if you hadn't studied, written about, or studied TV for 14 or 15 years, or things that we thought of were more visual? But of course we know they're audio-visual. And then when I looked at a lot of media, I'm a sociologist who moved into media, that's why I was surprised. And then I looked at stuff on TV, for example, and people read the sound as if they were reading the image. That is, the sonic dimension of experience wasn't there, really. So, halfway through my work on the Walkman, I discovered I was working on sound. And then I turned my attention to urban studies. And urban studies was a very strange beast. It seemed to me that urban writers didn't like things that moved very much, so they were much happier with buildings or streets, but not so much about what people did when they were walking through them. When they did talk about what people did when they walked through them, they often referred back to late 19th and early 20th century writings on what people did when they walked around cities. So they drew their work from writers like Zimmel, Walter Benjamin, and a few other people. So we all know that Zimmel, had this notion of the blasé character, for example, the person that created a grey monotone image of the city in order to maintain their own autonomy. That's fair enough. He was one of the first writers to talk about sensory overload and the sensory mix of cities, actually, which was very interesting. Walter Benjamin, they took the notion of Flannery from Walter Benjamin and argued that, in fact, well, actually, if you did walk through cities, okay, you were more or less a kind of flaneur, for example. Even though Walter Benjamin had actually kind of thought the concept wasn't any good by 1934 or something. So I thought it was quite strange that, in fact, kind of urban studies had not really come to grips adequately with how people move through cities. Media studies didn't discuss sound and only really liked to talk about people sitting in their living rooms. So you had this kind of funny thing. So the media studies were happy if, in fact, you did a study of how people watch TV, for example, or how people listen to the radio, maybe. But if you took your behaviour outside of the domestic sphere, it suddenly became a kind of realm that wasn't really discussed. Because that was surely then urban studies. But urban studies weren't too interested in looking at it either. So kind of my own work kind of was this hybrid between a kind of sociology of media usage, mobile media usage, and an interrogation of, in fact, how that related to the meaning of urban space. And so I kind of started with that, and I thought my first work on the Walkman, I kind of argued that the method was a kind of prismatic one, if there is such a thing, but a prismatic method, whereby you use the object and its use as a prism through which to understand broader social phenomena. So this very small piece of technology became a way of trying to understand the nature of behaviour, of mobile behaviour in urban space. And I continued doing that with... When I did the Walkman book, I thought, that's it, actually. I thought, I've done that. And I was surprised, really, by the speed of technological change, that by 2001, the iPod came out. And by about 2003, I kind of thought, I'd better look at this then. Reluctantly, actually, and I thought I would do a little secondary study, a kind of update. And I had this very naive... I didn't know very many people with iPods in Brighton. There were some, but at that time. And so I was being interviewed by... I think I got interviewed by the New York Times first. I did an interview for them, and I said, actually, while you're at it, could you put a little thing at the bottom of it saying, I'm going to do some iPod research, I'd like people to contact me. And they said, yeah, that's fine. And then I got a couple more interviews in different places, and Wired News in California or something. I did the same with them. And in my naivety, and I just said, here's my email address. So this is not a good advert for Method. Here's my email address, and just get people to... I got thousands and thousands, and of course, once I set the thing up, I couldn't change it. So I had this... They were coming in faster than I could reply for about a few weeks. And then it got syndicated all around the world. And then people were saying, I've just looked at your request in Elle magazine. I thought, Elle magazine? And so it kind of became a book, just actually by accident, because of the massive stuff. I thought, well, actually, I've got enough to start writing a book on it. So that's how we got here. And of course, now at the time of speaking, in some ways, the iPod is a bit of a historical object, actually, isn't it? It's been superseded in some respects by the iPhone, for sure, which does a lot of the things that the iPod does and a lot of other things. So in some senses, we're in a realm of multiple connectivity, I think, whereas my work on the iPod was a bit more singular connectivity. Although I would say, in defence, that the kind of extra capacities or potential that things like iPhones have are largely visually orientated, yeah? And it doesn't detract from the auditory aspect of the technology, I think. Yeah? But I've refused. I got asked if I'd do some research on iPhones, and I said no. It's intellectually, it's chasing the technology. I don't. Anyway, I didn't want to do it. I will do some work on it, but not as a main thing. Okay. So that's the preamble. How long do we? Is it an hour or an hour?
We have about an hour and a half,
and you need some question. Yeah. I did some.
And
that's good. I did a talk in Amsterdam a little while ago, and I asked them how long I could talk for, and they said it doesn't matter, Michael. So I did 2.25 hours, and you can see how, because I ramble, you can see how that happens. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning then. I have a kind of theory that when you're looking at how we use sound, you can understand it through 3 different moments of sound, which are, in fact, nothing to do with sound as such, but to do with, in fact, production and economic organisation. And I use these 3 categories of the traditional ones: Fordism, post-Fordism, and the one I made up, hyper-post-Fordism. I don't know why I made it up. Hyper-post-Fordism. And Fordism is the classic phase of capitalist production, where Henry Ford said you can have any colour Ford you want as long as it's black. Yeah? And that the classic period takes us up into the 1950s, where you have that phrase of keeping up with the Joneses. So you measure yourself by being the same as others, essentially. Then you have post-Fordism, which is kind of niche marketing, which develops really through the 60s, 70s, and is still there. So that's the idea of the multiplicity of radio channels, etc. The niche marketing in all of its forms. And hyper-post-Fordism are my iPod users, who in fact consider themselves to be individualizing in their experience and in their approach to consumption. Now, these are 3 moments in culture, it strikes me, that to some extent go along in parallel. It's not either or. And so if we're looking at today, for example, we have elements of Fordism in our culture, in as much as I don't know what TV programs you watch in Canada, but in England, for example, we still have things like soaps and Coronation Street and all these things that regularly get more viewers than anybody else. You have
Coronation.
You have Coronation Street. Look at that. It's not called British Columbia for nothing. It's good because I did notice there was a picture of the Queen on the $20 note. Now, of course, one can access these programs at different times, for example, although the majority of people don't. Just as there are Fordist elements of large football matches, etc., etc., etc. Post-Fordism is obviously alive and well in the plethora of television channels, radio channels, etc., etc., boutique shops, etc., etc. If you go into, I don't know if you've got posh jean shops in Vancouver, where you'll find that they'll have their own individualized soundscape with it as well. So the music has to match the jeans, and the jeans has to match the money. Because why would you want to be going... You don't want to get the prime art experience in a shop where you're spending $200 on a pair of jeans, for example. So that goes along in parallel with Fordism. And with iPod users, my classic tale is that you go into the expensive jean shop and they've got their music, which they think is the music for people that want to spend $200 on a pair of jeans. And the iPod user, in fact, superimposes his or her own sound onto that. Because the other is not what they want. So those three things go in parallel. Now, the idea is, probably in culture, is that the hyper-post-Fordist is becoming more significant. That's all. That's the only thing I'd say. Okay. So I'm going to kind of frame some of this stuff around that. And let's see if it makes sense. Yeah. And I'm going to bounce it against urban theory. So I'm going to talk about those three things through iPod use, and I'm going to bounce it against a kind of different theories of urban culture that tries to explain what this kind of behaviour is and doesn't explain it very well. And then try to explain what iPod use in some form can tell us about sound and urban culture. So I'll start. Whether this... I hope it's going to make sense. Yeah? So an example of Fordism is some years ago I went to Japan, and I went to this Buddhist sanctuary in Japan called Koyasan near Kyoto. Anybody been there? It's very nice. It's very and anyway, it's on this kind of big plateau, and you can only, there's no cars. You can only get to it by this kind of elevator thing. And anyway, one evening when I was there, I wanted to visit the graveyard that's there, which is hundreds of years old. And I was walking around this space, and it was about 7 o'clock, and it was kind of quite peaceful. And I shouldn't talk about this with soundscape people here, but all I could hear was things like birds and other, rustling and things like this. 7 o'clock, suddenly there was this, what I can only describe as celestial shopping music, kind of coming from the whole graveyard. And in fact, the whole place was wired up with speakers, and it was this kind of tinkly stuff. Yeah? And it was kind of, I have this memory of, from this serene and peaceful surroundings, I suddenly thought I was in some kind of episode from, I don't know, Twin Peaks or something like that, that the whole thing had become kind of sinister. And it's just an illustrative example, really, about how space can be involuntarily colonized in terms of the subject by sound, for example. And that, I found that very difficult to ignore. Of course, my own response to it was individual. So I assumed that nobody else walking around the graveyard thought Twin Peaks. But in fact, interestingly enough, the association I had with it was with a mediated experience in my own biography. Yeah? That is, the superimposed meaning was in fact of a media experience. And in some sense, what I want to argue today is that increasing amounts of our experience are mediated in this way. So even the individualism encapsulated in much of the experience is a mediated individualism. And you can see where I'm going to go with this, maybe. Of course, this is a Fordist explanation. If I'd had an iPod, or Walkman at that time, if I'd had a Walkman, then in fact I could have shut the sound out and replaced it with something else, more conducive to what I wanted to hear. I don't know what it would have been. But one method would be to use, at that time, the Walkman as a way of getting rid of the other music. Yeah? So the substitution of the soundscape in representational space by a privatized soundscape which is more pleasing, but created as a consequence of the pre-existing soundscape. Alternatively, I could have gone into the graveyard with it on anyway, because I had my own celestial shopping music which I wanted to hear in order to experience the graveyard more meaningfully for me. Yeah? So two different explanations. Yeah? One as a response to a pre-existing soundscape. The second as a desire to create my own soundscape, precisely because that enhances what the experience would be for me. Yeah? So in that little example is a kind of a critique of people like Zimmel, for example. Of course, Zimmel, way before mobile technology. A critique of the people that use Zimmel. Yeah? The idea that all our behaviour is in some sense or other a response to the external, yeah? And not as a self-generated form of behaviour that is substituting for something else. Okay. So one of the, using that example, one of the interesting things about when you actually do empirical work on what people do with something is you get more complex answers than if you go to people talking about, I don't know, Benjamin's flaneur or Zimmel's blasé character. That is, that the things that people do not always fit into those traditional categories, I think. So on a methodological level, what I would say is if in fact you're looking at changing soundscapes, changing behaviour through which we mediated through technologies, for example, don't just look at my work or other people's work. Go out and do some research yourselves, actually, because you'll find that actually some things don't work as they did anymore. Anyway, so that's the first example. The significance of looking at mobile sound, I think, speaks for itself in as much as, okay, not everybody has Apple iPods, but in fact, millions of people have MP3 phones, for example. Yeah? MP3 phones, probably, I think the last statistics I saw, over half of Western populations have MP3 phones, yeah? Which means that over half the population at any time they want or desire can, in fact, privatise their environment. Yeah? They don't all privatise it, or the privatising takes different elements. You can share headphones, for example. in London, sorry, in London now, I don't know if you have this in Vancouver, with kids with their mobile phones, instead of putting they do this in the underground, so they play it to you. It's like mini ghetto blasters. Do they do that in Vancouver?
I've seen it.
Yeah, you've seen it. which is a different phenomena. And that's a phenomena, it's mobile, which has a lot in common with driving your car with your sound system on with your windows down, yeah? Which is that you colonize the space. Yeah? So this space you're still privatizing it in some sense by colonizing it for everybody else. It's like on those, if you're on a beach, somebody said there's a naked beach down there. But anyway, I had this image of hardy Canadians in the middle of winter taking all their clothes off. Yeah. Maybe somewhere. Anyway, so, if you think of a beach as a space, and then you have those people, normally men actually, that ride those big, what are they called?
Jet skis.
Yeah, those things, yeah, jet skis. And of course they're really noisy, aren't they? So essentially they transform the whole space, don't they? Yeah? And isn't that a form of privatizing of space? Yeah? Which is far more, kind of damaging than the other privatizing of space. So the point there is that there are different ways in which you can use mobile technologies to change both your relationship to space, but other people's relationship as well. So over 50% of people can do this. The age of mechanical reproduction, which is what we're talking about, to take Benjamin's phrase, is an age of increasing sonic saturation and the colonization of urban spaces, both public and private. And in fact, it's quite difficult now to work out what might be public and private, or whether these are useful terms anymore, actually. Through the 20th and 21st centuries, we've increasingly moved to music, originally through the provision of Fordist technologies like for the now defunct music organisation MUSAC. I mean, it's an interesting tale that MUSAC goes bankrupt. About 6 years ago, was it? Six years?
Oh, more is it?
Was it more?
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
You end up, each year you forget. And in fact, it's quite interesting because the MUSAC, they went bankrupt even though they changed. Because if you look at what they did in the last 10 years, they'd become like post-Fordist, where they were selling, kind of music to these retail outlets specifically orientated for them. And they still didn't, it still didn't work. And there are different reasons for that, but I think it's quite interesting. So the idea that even they had realised that creating a wide range of sonic environments of uniformity for consumers was passé, for example. So, okay. Where was it? So this goes all the way through to hyper-post-Fordist technologies of the Apple iPod, through which, with the aid of a pair of headphones, users create individualized and mobile soundscapes through the filtering out of random urban sounds. iPod use might be interpreted as representing the culmination of over a century of media use in which sensory filtering has become second nature to many users. So this notion of sensory filtering, I think, is important. And to some extent, I mean, all of media is sensory filtering, actually, isn't it? If you, without going down fully down the Marshall-McLuhan mode, all media consumption is about sensory enhancement and sensory deprivation, isn't it? Right? So that in fact, even the audiovisual denies gates out smells, tastes, touches. Yeah? And it's quite weird if you think about you can do these statistics where they're kind of cumulative statistics to show that in fact people use some form of media for 26 hours a day. I think it was Australians. It might have something to do with Australians. Have we got any Australians here? We can say whatever we want, yeah? 26 hours a day. So, of course, the reason you get 26 hours a day is parallel usage. Yeah? So, listening to the radio, playing your guitar, texting or whatever, yeah? Yeah, even taking notes is fine, yeah? I'm not picking on you, it's all right. But in fact, if it's true that all this media use is changing or denying certain, or enhancing as well, certain sensory capacities, then that strikes me as really significant. It's not like just a little bit. It's a lot, isn't it, in that sense? And that opens up a whole can of worms, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, yeah? Not today. Okay. So, from the early radio users who listened privately through headphones in their living rooms, to users of transistor radios, to those hermetically sealed automobile users, everyday urban experience has become increasingly mediated by an array of technologies which have, to follow Walter Benjamin, both trained and conditioned the human sensorium. And this is, in some ways, if one goes back to Zimmel, that's what Zimmel was talking about as well, and that's the progressive thing, is trying to talk about how the sensory organisation of subjectivity changes within urban culture. So technologies such as the Apple iPod, for the example, have rapidly transformed what it means to live in the city for many users, re-empowering them whilst also reorganising their sensory orientation to the urban. And look, I was looking at, I'm not selling this, it's just, it's far too expensive. And if you've written a book or anything, people say, oh, it's really expensive. And I say, yeah, every time I sell a copy, I can buy half a Mars bar. Which is about right, actually, isn't it? And this notion of sensory orientation and the sonic, I think is personified, and the complex nature of what it is personified by this woman I interviewed, Janet, American, yeah? And this tells us both about the urban, the response, and the desire. And just this one little quote, and it's a great quote. She said, well, I think I've come to the conclusion that overall I feel pretty out of control in my life. Stores play music to get me to buy more. Work tells me what to do and when. Traffic decides how quickly I get from here to there. Even being in public places forces me to endure other people and their habits. The guy slurping his soup. The brat crying for a piece of candy. Liberal, yeah? I didn't realise how much I yearn for control and probably peace and quiet. Strange, since I'm blasting music in my ears. So that's, I yearn for control and peace and quiet. Strange, since I'm blasting music in my ears. I think I'm really tired of living on someone else's schedule. The iPod has given me some control back. Great quote. I couldn't have made it up, but in fact, it shows you the complex circumstance of this woman's sense of the social and the role of the technology in it. Because in some sense, all of this is about how what do these things tell us about how we construct our sense of construct the social, our sense, and what is our sense of the social? And in some ways, Janet here she's pressurized. Yeah? So it is the out of control urban environment, or her daily schedule within it. So we spend more time commuting, maybe not in Vancouver because of the standard of living and happy people, but more time commuting. Maybe the spaces that we move through are increasingly mundane. Maybe the job we're going to we're not that happy about, etc., etc., etc. So, in Janet's case, she's also becomes intolerant to other people. Yeah? Interestingly enough, one of the questions we can have with this is that I talk very generally about this stuff, and then you can say, well, what about are Vancouverans the same as New Yorkers, for example? Certainly the case of the people I interviewed in New York, they were the least tolerant of anybody else in terms of other people, in the sense of on the street. So, a kind of an explanation of the way in which people use these technologies has to be able to address a quote like that from Janet, for example. It's not the only one. There's lots of different ones, but in fact, it has to be able to do this. Okay. I'm gonna start missing stuff out because I've only got to page 2. Yeah. It happens, you see. I was frightened that I might fall asleep talking. Okay, so we know, for example, that by putting a pair of headphones on, it's a very transformative experience. It's one of the most transformative you can have. And in the first book, I used that lovely quote from William Gibson. Is William Gibson Canadian?
From Vancouver, yeah.
Perfect. I hadn't realised that when I put this quote down. And he's, the Sony Walkman has done more to change human perception than any virtual reality gadget. I can't remember any technological experience since that was quite so wonderful as being able to take music and move it through landscapes and architecture. So it's a nice quote. And that was him describing his own use. And of course, what it does is it re-empowers the ear. So the notion of the historical passivity of the ears, which has been naturalized, then becomes historicized with technology, whereby you can kind of supersede, you can transform, you can close your ears whilst opening them at the same time, obviously. Closing your ears to the world, opening them to, in fact, the sounds that are emanating from the headphones. Normally, what I'd call products of the culture industry. And did you have Jonathan Stern here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because his stuff's on that. So he's done the history of that. The only thing I dispute with Jonathan is his dates. That in fact, it strikes me that the privatizing element of this goes all the way back in Western culture. And I use the example of the Odyssey to explain that. Yeah? Homer's Odyssey, where the technology there is wax. Yeah? It is a technology of sorts, yeah. But the Odysseus and the Sirens. It's that, and it's used in the dialectic of enlightenment. And Odysseus. The sirens encapsulate everything that is to be known and will be known. And of course, it's a story of aestheticization and the role of sound in aestheticization. Although Adorno tends to look at the social class element more. Maybe what happens to the oarsman. And So in that story, what you see is that, you know, Odysseus has himself strapped to the mast, and the poor old oarsmen have their ears blocked up, and so they're rowing, goes through the straits, and Odysseus can hear the sirens, but he can't do anything about it. So of course it's a story of the aestheticization of desire. Yeah? But in fact, what Adorno doesn't do is that actually when you look at the soundscape, it's a privatized soundscape between the sirens who make the soundscape and Odysseus. Yeah? It's the first example of the privatization of experience. Yeah? It's perfect. And of course, what he then does is incorporate that into his biography. Yeah? He only has to go through it once. So I use that example to show that Jonathan's start way back further. That it's a tale of essentially Western imperialism and sound involved in that notion. Yeah? And there's all sorts of ways you can go with that, but that's just everything else was good. Right. So the qualities of that kind of sonic experience is kind of an immersive one, yeah, and it's powerful precisely because it's immersive qualities. And most iPod users actually kind of listen loud, yeah. Not all of them, but most listen loud. Yeah? Because actually, when the louder, well, loud in relationship to external sound. Yeah. So when you talk to people using it in the underground, you haven't got an underground in Vancouver, have you? Have you?
Kind of.
Kind of.
It's sometimes above, sometimes it's under.
It sometimes goes down. Right? So the right, okay. so if you look at what people do, they will, when the train stops, if they're attentive people, they'll turn the sound down a little bit. Train stops, they'll turn it up again. After a half-hour journey, it's gone up about 30%. They haven't noticed that they keep making it louder and louder, and they do that to compensate for the sound. If you do that too often, you can lose some hearing, but it's like smoking. People don't think they're going to lose their hearing, and it happens over a period of time. So if you tell people, actually, you shouldn't play it that loud. Don't take any notice. Yeah? So Francis Dyson has written a nice book just recently on media sound. Has recently commented upon the intimate relationship between sound technologies and immersion. She says, sound is the immersive medium par excellence, three-dimensional, interactive, and synesthetic, perceived in the here and now of an embodied space. Sound returns to the listener the very same qualities that media mediates. That feeling of being here now, of experiencing oneself as engulfed, enveloped, enmeshed. In short, immersed in an environment sound surrounds. Great quote. I mean, so the Dyson's book is actually, if you don't know it, that's a good book to look at. Because her argument is that actually in virtual reality, that the dominant visual kind of hegemony, if you like, is trying to pinch sound from sound in order to talk about vision like this. And it throws open all sorts of things about where am I, kind of, so am I in the box, or am I looking at the screen thinking I'm in the box, in that sense. So the book is a defense of sound, actually, which is good. It's a nice book. So iPod use valorizes the here and now. Instrumental in creating this immersive state is the use of headphones, of course. And but in the fully mediated world of the iPod user, lies the dream of unmediated experience. And this is kind of interesting. Because in fact it's fully mediated. So if in fact I'm walking down the street and I'm listening to something and it makes me think that this is a beautiful environment on a sunny day and Vancouver's the happiest city in the world, and so I've got happy music on to you know, and so I'm you know it's sunnier and more happy through the music, yeah, in that sense, yeah. Or if I'm walking down the street and I'm a bit glum because I don't know, my cat just died or something like this. And so I've got Leonard Cohen, who's another Canadian, I think, yeah? You know, I fell into an avalanche, it covered up my soul. So I'm kind of going along because the cat's just died. So the environment is resonant with my own feelings, for example. If, in fact, both of those are totally mediated, no? Now, the strange thing is that when you talk to users, it's as if their experience is unmediated. Right? So the invisibility of the technology, which is so immersive, yet becomes naturalized. So the idea is that this mediated experience of listening to something through headphones gives you direct access to the world and your own emotions. Yeah? So it's a mediation that paradoxically conceives of experience in its immediacy. Yeah? And that's a paradox. So that we have that notion that sound for many users, or music for many users, has become such second nature that it ceases to be recognized as mediation. Yeah? Yet, nevertheless, users will turn round and say, well, I can't do any of this stuff without this. I can't imagine this. I can't manage, rather like Janet, I can't manage my emotions so well without this. Yeah? The way I maintain my mood as I walk down the street is through this soundtrack. Or the way in which I like to walk down the street and imagine my own relationship to the world is through fast forwarding on the iPod, for example. And the number of people that use their technology from the time they leave their house to the time they actually arrive somewhere is pretty common. Yeah? And I interview people even that will walk into their offices and go right up and take it off at the very last moment and say, oh, hi there, you know, to their work friends or something. Or when I did the Walkman book, I interviewed loads of people that actually took longer to get to work. They hated their journey. They took longer to get to work because they wanted to get to the end of the tape. And so they describe walking round or whatever. Because, of course, in a sense, their time is repossessed as well. Right? So Janet, that quote I used there, is actually repossessing her time. It's an empowering technology, but empowering through the dependency on the technology. So that's again another paradox. Right. We're gonna. That's page 5. Okay. I'm gonna skip some of this stuff because I don't want to talk about it. Let's go on to. You can see, look, there's a lot of this stuff I thought I would say. Okay. So what are we going to make of this? Well, the image of urban experience that we get, if we're going to use people walking around with headphones as a kind of a significant moment in urban culture, then it's certainly the case that the image of urban life is a different one than in traditional urban literature. You know? Do we go down a deserto path, for example, which is one in which these journeys are individualized, separate, never to be repeated, in which case they could be construed of as liberating? Are we going to go down that path? Yeah. So in fact, the city, in its plenitude, becomes mine, and so the tactics I use to go through the city is emancipatory. Are we going to take a route of, I don't know, somebody like Marc Augé, for example? It's French, not Canadian, yeah? Who talks about urban response in terms of semiotically empty urban space, so non-spaces of cities. So our cities, not Vancouver, but most cities become kind of a bit like parking lots. Yeah, you go into in England, you go to almost any town, and it's the same shops. So they've kind of made all these kind of uniformity. You could be dropped in there at midnight by parachute, and you'd become totally disorientated because you could be anywhere in England, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So the idea would be that you respond, that space becomes meaningless, and it's an architectural issue. But iPod users, quite interestingly enough, can make any space a non-space. Yeah? It could be you could make the Sistine Chapel a non-space, yeah? By recreating your own soundscape within it. Yeah? That is, the disposition to recreate space may not have anything to do with the nature of the space itself. Huh? Or it may do. You might be walking through, I don't know, some shopping mall and think, this is, it's better with you too, or something like that, yeah? Or you might think, well, actually, I'm not interested in any of these spaces. Even the Sistine Chapel, they might say, well, I've come here involuntarily, or whatever, or my mind is on something else, and I can construct meaning around it through listening. You could take a Richard Sennett viewpoint of urban space, for example, which is it's a little bit similar to Augé's, which is cities represent for him a kind of Protestantism of the spirit, which is the idea. He argued that people had grown silent in cities, and so looked more. That looks were about casual surfaces, no depth. So people created a kind of silent cocoon around themselves, not in a blasé way that Zimmel would describe, but as a kind of almost like a cultural imperative of leave me alone. And in some senses, iPod users, kind of have a little bit of that in them as well. So they have a little bit of Sennett, they have a little bit of Zimmel, they have a little bit of Augé, and actually probably a little bit of de Certeau. It's how those things work, I think, that are important. So I've just done that. I want to just, before I finish, I just want to go on to the last bit. So we can have some time for questions. Yeah. Okay. I can talk this one. But how does the use of technologies like iPods impact on notions of cosmopolitanism? And the history of cities, and walking around Vancouver, it's very cosmopolitan, actually, isn't it? Yeah? Well, I think it is from what I've seen. And cosmopolitanism is about recognition of the other, to some extent. And when you look at all those traditional writings on urban city centres, it's all about recognising the other as different, and cities as this kind of a kind of polyrhythmic, kind of Lefebvre talks about the polyrhythmic nature of cities. Joseph Roth, in a lot of his travel writings in the 30s, talks about French cities, places like Marseille, as this conglomeration of sounds, which in some sense are inclusive. So when you put on headphones, how does cosmopolitanism work? Yeah? And I kind of think there are these lovely quotes of people saying, when I go to New York, I have to have my New York playlist, because this New York playlist is got full of music that reminds me of New York, and New York's more like it is with this music. So there's that, that notion that New York, it's that mediated thing, whereby the real New York is only real if it's suggested by a New York soundtrack which is in your head. So the cosmopolitanism, I think, is actually in the soundtrack. It's not in the relationship in that sense. And when you look at people like Janet, who say, well, actually, I'm not interested in that. Or if you look at some other users who will say, well, if you look at the aesthetic dimension of iPod use, where I construct the meaning of the street, for example, yeah? And I could construct the meaning of you in the street as well. You could be part of my private fantasy through music, for example. Yeah? What I'm doing is making you in the image of me. Yeah? So I'm constructing you as maybe actors in my play. Yeah? Or imagining you as something to do with me. Yeah? And so in fact what it is, it's a form of mimesis. It's mimetic. If you look at flannerism, for good or bad, Walter Benjamin, then the flaneur is the alienated subject who imagines what it is to be you. That is, me going out towards you thinking, what's it like to be you? Yeah? And imagining what it is. Yeah? It's the opposite to icons. We're thinking, you are going to be what I construct you. Part of my own work. So, in a sense, when I come back to looking at how these technologies construct the social, it's constructing the social in an anti-cosmopolitan, mimetic way, I think. But which, nevertheless, is one of the most pleasurable experiences that people describe having. Yeah? That is, most people say sound never disappoints. Yeah? They can, because of its intensity, it doesn't suffer the routinization but nearly every other technology suffers. Yeah? So, and this may not be true of iPhones because it incorporates it. But if in the days if you look at people's telephone use, for example, it soon becomes routinized. Yeah? There's a pattern. And my joke about telephones is the telephone's only as good as the person you're talking to. Yeah? Whereas the Beatles are always the Beatles in that sense. Yeah? And so obviously there are different circumstances when you would want your mobile phone. But when you look at when I went to do I did a kind of repeat thing with the iPod users 2 years after I'd first interviewed them, and nearly all of them said they listened as much 2 years later as when they first started, and nearly all of them said they listened almost twice as much post-iPod to pre-iPod. So in fact, it didn't seem to suffer the routinization. I'll stop there, and then we can. I like questions. I like answering questions, actually. Yeah? Is that good? Is that enough? Yeah. Don't be shy. I've left lots of stuff out because I've chatted to you.
Yeah, I have a question about, so we're talking about the end user in terms of receiving of this music, this musical product of recording. But we haven't talked at all about the production of music and the receiving of the distribution. One of the things I'm working on right now is looking at all the apps that are music making apps, which you have on the iPhone, which actually allow you to share with other users of that. And I sort of see, sort of from the last 100 years or so, we turn music into a recorded product, right? And then we have this definition of individual taste and genre, right? And this whole identification itself, and the sort of symbolic association that starts happening in terms of that. So I just sort of wanted to know in terms of the production side, and also with the user producing it.
My little thing here is about privatizing. So which is a kind of the dominant element, but not the only element, for sure. If you're looking at production, it's interesting that the iPod really only became really successful with iTunes. And so the real killer thing was producing the loop, the production consumption loop. And that spawns everything else to some extent. So when you're looking at the collaborative aspects of music through the technology, I'm still kind of quite dubious of that as anything other than a minority sport. It does, I'm also wary of those kind of technologies which are developing, which will allow you to find out what other people are listening to, because it goes against some of the thing about being in your own world. And there are stories about that.
Sharing playlists.
Yes, right. Yeah. There's that great chapter in Levy's book on the iPod. He's the business editor of Newsweek, and he does this great thing where he imagines he's really quite pleased with himself and his record collection. He had the BMW, one of the first BMWs that had the iPod connector in it. And anyway, he thinks, well, I'd like to know what other people are listening to. So he puts an advert out saying, I'll swap my music with your music, and he interviews kind of this sort of people, not and he finds this woman who's got this weird taste that he thinks, I've not heard this music before. This is really, and so he swaps what's on his iPod with hers, and then they talk about it afterwards. And so he's really excited that this woman is alternative and all the rest of it, and then. And he's brave enough to put this in his book, actually. And her account of him is
self-satisfied middle class man who thinks his music is alternative but is mainstream. So there's a danger, you see, in once you go beyond the self in terms of collaborative stuff. In terms of music production, I mean, it's more to do not so much with the listening technology, if you like, with what digitization allows you to do. And of course, it's one more technology that you think would put a nail on the head of a 3-minute song. Because actually you can make whatever you want. But we know the resistance to that actually within culture, because there's been no reason to have a 3-minute song ever since the demise of 78, because that's what they're there for. So there's lots of potential there, I think, and in terms of music making, collaboration, and all the rest of it. Whether that happens or not, I mean, I kind of think my own take on iPods and iTunes is that it's shaken up a very lazy, indolent music industry, which always gave people as little as possible. And ideally, you would imagine they will start spending their money more democratically and not spending so much money on big stars. That's one thing. But there's also parallel, just as I said, there's Fordism, post-Fordism, hyper-post-Fordism. There's all this move to reality TV shows with that hold charts and stuff, and that's very traditional in terms of music taste and production, isn't it? So they go along in parallel, it seems to me. But
I was wondering if you think what you call a mobile listener would be different than, say, something like what Adorno would call the structural listener, this list of listeners in sociology and music.
Yeah, active and passive and stuff like this.
Yeah, I was wondering if the mobile listener is unique in that way against other forms of listening that people have written about.
I like Adorno's work on music. And as long as you don't kind of hypostasize active and passive, I think you see there's active and passive within each listener, rather than as discrete people. In terms of iPod users, as distinct from other users, I kind of think it's much more a listening self than previous, and that's the technology permits that. And what I mean by that is that it enables you to be attentive to the music, your mood, and the surroundings in ways that you haven't been able to do before. So, for example, if something doesn't quite fit your mood, you can fast forward it to get it there until you find something that does. So this is the technology kind of interacting with your own cognition and potentially heightening your understanding or your sensibility, your musical sensibility in relationship to those things. So in that sense, that's a positive moment, it seems to me. A negative moment is those people that they've got so much music on they can't listen to the whole track anymore. They're clicking on halfway through the song, and that's the negative moment. They may not be the same people, but it's embodied in the technology. So yeah, I kind of think the stuff on music listening in the literature is not very good. I mean, Adorno's one of the better ones. And in my own work, I've shied away from what this actual song does. I've never felt confident in that.
So I'm trying to think about a couple of things together, and I'm wondering how much this is really a story about cities. And So in the sense that do you need to actually be in the city to experience the iPod in the way that you're describing?
No.
I mean, what's the requirement? Is the requirement that you be walking or that you be in a certain kind of dense space? And then I started sort of expanding out from that and thinking, okay, well, so what about the suburbs? And are people listening to iPods in the suburbs in the same way? And I thought, well, people most of the time in the suburbs spend most of their time in cars, right?
In America,
and a car is a different kind of I mean, and so in a funny kind of way, I got the end of that was, so if the iPod listening in the city is making people less cosmopolitan, then are the cosmopolites now in the suburbs driving around in their cars being forced to share the music, with their daughters or sons or whatever, right? And so, do you see what I mean?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that's good. You don't have to be in the city. There are different dynamics in small towns and villages because you're more likely to know the people if you're walking down the street who they are, and you can't do the same distancing techniques that are habitual in cities because you're not going to see the person again. My take on it is that it's all urban culture. Maybe flying over that wasteland of Canada yesterday, I'll have to rethink that. But it seems to me that if you live in a village, you're almost more technologically dependent than anybody. You have to have all this stuff. Yeah? You communicate in the same way. You don't walk down the street necessarily in the same way. You could argue that suburbs are isolationary anyway, socially isolationary. I'm not certainly in America. And there's lots of literature on the suburbanization of culture where people are locked into their rooms, their homes, and then they get in their car. And in my book I have these things where these people say they don't have to talk to anybody anymore because it's self-service pay stuff, and so you don't have interaction with people directly. And to some extent, in my presentation, I kind of slightly abstracted the iPod, whereas in reality, you should fit it in with all these other technologies that are distancing technologies to some extent. The car is an interesting one, because you can see who controls the sound system in the car. And of course, it's radios are very different from iPods, for example. Yeah? So, by definition, a radio is you're communing with something outside of the car in some sense or form. And it's quite interesting looking at how people flick in and out of radio and iPod, for example. But they'll do stuff like, Friday. A lot of people on a Friday afternoon will have a specific radio channel on because it signifies the end of the week for them and stuff like that. And traffic and all those things. But when you look at, 80% of car rides are done by individuals with nobody else in the car. So cars are not very social spaces. There is an increased tendency for the kids to be in the back of the car with headphones on, and dad or mum listening to what they want in the car. So you have this. And in the book, I also did how people do that at work as well. There was one group of people, there were 5 of them, and the guy said, "Well, 4 of us have our headphones on all the time at work in the office, open plan office." And I said, "Well, what about the 5th one?" And they said, "Well, he can do what he wants. We can't hear him." But so the car dynamic is a little bit different. It's, when you look at people streaming their iPod through the sound system, then it's pretty much the same. They'll have, whatever it is. It's more interesting looking at interaction as to, normally it's the driver that defines what's going to be played. Normally. And then it's interesting watching people argue about music in that confined space. I've got a chapter on cars in the book. It's a bigger topic. It's a bigger topic than I made of it.
I find the number of testimonials you receive as a result of the articles in the New York Times quite interesting.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that you're getting a sense of how Walkmans and iPods transform people's experiences. You gave the quote of someone who felt that she was regaining a sense of control over her own time through this device. And I'm wondering, in these testimonials, if you saw not only that sort of general transformation of life, but more specific sort of psychological transformations that may not only relate to the urban space, how people experience moving through urban spaces, but also sort of how it might change their physicality, their body, their because of course we all notice on transit, for example, people moving to music that we can't hear, for example. Sometimes we see people walking down the street rapping to a soundtrack that we can't hear, for example. So I'm wondering if that transformative experience showed up in it.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I didn't talk about it at all, but it does. And it's really interesting. That I remember in the Walkman book, I interviewed this woman who was quite diminutive, and she used to walk down the street with the soundtrack of Reservoir Dogs on, and she used to describe kind of pushing her way past people, and so there's obviously that, and a lot of people will walk differently, etc. It's the interesting thing intersensorially, and especially when I talked about this thing about sensory deprivation and enhancement, is that people's sense of touch seems to be diminished, so that you're not so attentive to people rubbing up against you, because the sonic is more dominant, and so that makes it easier for you to be in a crowded space, essentially, and depending on what you're listening to as to whether you're, but there's similar stuff with cars actually, where nearly all the studies are done under test conditions, where you can show that people drive more aggressively to certain sort of music, for example. Whether they actually drive more aggressively when they're in the car, we don't know, because all those studies are done in simulators. But certainly the simulated stuff seems to indicate that. But I kind of think it's interesting that and again, there's a notion of immediacy here, because I think when you often when you look at people talking to someone on the mobile phone, it's as if the person's in front of them. So they're doing all the gesticulation and stuff like that. So there's a kind of, not always for sure, but there is something interesting there about simulated immediacy, I think. But we know there was an advert though in see, people do like being in control. So I think the movements don't show them out of control, they're still in control. And I kind of remember, there was an advert in the UK, it was not an Ericsson one, it was what's the Swedish phone company? Nokia. And they did this MP3 phone, and it was made for the English market, and they showed this woman listening to music, and she gets carried away, she misses her train, and people start throwing money at her. And I was at this conference, and they had the marketing director for Nokia Europe, and I said, do you realise that that advert will put people off buying it because the underlying motivation is control. And you've shown this woman being out of control. And he says, that has nothing to do with me, that comes from a different department. So, but they're interesting. You could do a whole study, I think, on that notion of body. And obviously it's not just body, it's body and cognition, which I haven't done. I've touched on it through, but not in a systematic way. Sorry, you're going
It's been touched.
No.
Can I ask a question?
You can ask anything you want, yeah.
Well, because I was wondering, and I wonder what you think of it and whether people actually reflected on that themselves. But it just struck me when you read Janet's testimonial about the whole idea of being very, very annoyed by having to put up with other people's sounds and feeling out of control because of it. I mean, to me, that's one can argue that's a result of the environment and urbanization and so on, but one can also argue that that's a disposition that's encouraged by culture and by a particular ideology. And because a lot of people, when they travel to another country to say, Mediterranean or the Middle East or somewhere where it's a very different cultural experience, you're just expected to put up with a huge amount of sensory overload and be fine with it, and people are fine with it. They're just expected to put up with like a lot of touch, a lot of shouting of merchants and so on, if you imagine like a museum. So why is it that we in North America are so incredibly annoyed by the smallest, tiniest things that we have this idea? Well, probably not just
there is an answer.
No,
there is an answer. There is an answer to it. Well, there's several answers, or possible answers. I think there is a very specific Western notion of private space and entitlement,
like
and
entitlement.
And road rage has something to do with this, whereby if someone encroaches on your space, you go nuts. Yeah? If you look at India, for example, there's very little evidence of road rage because they don't have the same notion of private space. And so, they're potentially more tolerant to people coming into that space. Yeah? So I think there's a kind of in some sense, a lot of this is a Western tale, which is what the intolerance to, I think you could argue that then is reinforced through all sorts of things, like the motor car, for example. There's a great article which I mentioned in the book, and this guy talks about secessionist culture, and it's the history of the car, and it's the history of the car in places like LA or whatever, where you kind of, the scum on the street. You got the car, you're in the car, and the whole motivation is to keep these away from you. And then people that can't afford cars, they're kind of have to go on. And then the aversion to public transport is because you don't want to mix with you've got
the plebs.
And then of course, then that becomes accentuated even more by you then having to have a tank, not a car, like a Hummer or something like this, and to some extent these are they're secessionist values and reinforcing what's already there. I think that's the thing. So we're not saying it's so. I certainly wouldn't say iPod users it causes this. It's part of a cultural matrix of what's going on. And some people are different than others. I mean, there's in the book lots of other examples of people in the southern states saying Mexicans are loud, they don't know how to behave. They're not polite like me, or whatever. So lots of intolerance as well, which comes in strong or weaker forms. Yeah? Is that an answer?
Oh, I mean, it's just a comment. It wasn't even really a question. It's just I was looking to talk about the larger cultural context. Yeah.
Well, I think it only makes sense actually when you talk about the larger cultural context. Whereas otherwise you abstract the technology out,
Yeah.
And then, you know, it's like when I did this, I got asked to write this article for the Times, London Times. It's a feature article on some of this stuff. And I wrote it, and the woman said, "Oh, Michael, could you make it more negative?" And of course I said no, and they didn't publish it. I thought, I'm not going to make it. Because what they wanted to say is, this is the word, you know.
Spot of the devil.
That's right. And of course, these things, you know, they're both. You know, they're both enhancing and restricting. And so depending on which way you're looking at it. And it's a dialectic of sorts.
But that's what I was thinking with the comments about the secessionist, the kind of secessionist kind of mentality, but and a lot in some ways, which is in tension with what you were talking about in terms of the kind of colonizing the space and making everybody a part of your theater, right? And so there's clearly this kind of tension between those two, and they're both acting at once, right?
Yeah.
And what's really kind of funny or interesting about that is you talk about it being a kind of empowering, right? And it's a kind of empowering really that's for everybody. Everybody can be sort of sitting there colonizing all the same space in their own kind of way, and there's no kind of there's space for everybody to sort of
this could be the de Certeau argument, you see, that actually, which I've not accentuated in the work, but you know, when I've really thought of that, you think, well, actually, there's maybe more liberating potential than I've written about, actually. You know, that's possible. I suppose it's...
But in your view, the colonizing isn't entirely positive, perhaps?
No. But it's... I think the reason why... I would say that it depends on your image of what a city should be and what the social should be. And you know, in a denuded social, does this make it even worse? That's, you know, even though it's better for the individual. So that's the debate, isn't it? So it's a there's no question that people using it are happy using it. There's no question about that.
You'd mentioned the empowering capacity, but also in some of your quotes you talked about people then no longer being able to experience an event unmediated.
That's right.
And no longer being able to experience New York without the soundtrack.
Or it's diminished. Or it's diminished without the soundtrack.
Right. So how do you address that kind of loss of capacity?
Well, I think for sure it's not true of everybody.
But if that's how you've certainly grown up as children in the backseat.
Well, I think the narrative is that mediation starts very young in all sorts of ways, and that one's taking this expectation of connectedness out in the streets. So in the past, people would walk around with transistor radios to their ear, etc. Or if you look at early examples of portable record players, you know, they could take them on a picnic. So there's a long history to it. It's the technology becomes more seamless, and so the stuff with, you know, things like the iPhone, for example, which then allows you to do your computing or connections whilst you're lying naked on the beach down the road, for example, you know, is part of that tale, isn't it? You know, and so this notion of second nature becomes important, it seems to me. That I mean, certainly some of the younger kids that I interviewed, you know, when I said, well, what's it like when you switch it off? And they say, I hate it. It's like nothing's there. I hate the silence. And of course, it's not silence, but that's how they describe it. And again, it's not true of everyone, but it's that notion of, it's a powerful thing. And to that extent, you know, if we were to make the moral judgment, you know, but they become moral judgments about, you know, is that it's not, and it's nothing you can do anything about particularly, because that's the way the world goes.
I guess you start, sorry, just one last thing. You started the discussion today with your example of Japan.
Yeah,
your experience
yeah.
in Kurosawa, and you ended up with two solutions, but not one of maybe dismantling the sound system that was introducing the issue.
I think one I wouldn't want to essentialise any of this. I mean, I did in the first book I did this typology of use, which struck me as quite a useful way of looking at it. So, what is the spectrum of possibilities available to the technology, through the technology? So, for example, it could be walking down a deserted urban street, listening, because there's no one there. And it could be because actually I don't like to be alone with my thoughts. It could be because I don't like the crowds. So there's a whole, you know, so one can look at the spectrum and then say, well, different things are going on here, but there may be some connections between them, I think. And that's kind of quite interesting. You're switching up, well, what happens when we have no more electricity? It's interesting. All of it's dependent on electricity, more or less. Sorry, that comes, yeah.
Oh, sorry, this one.
So you have to hand up first.
Sure. Well, I just think what you're saying is interesting, because when you go back and you trace those examples, you know, you go back to the where you are talking about electricity. And I think one of the implications of this is that there's been a change in musical practice where we don't sing.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have, you know, we used to have work songs, now we listen to music at work.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like there's been this change, and I think there is this desire for people to, one of the things about work songs, of course, they help you move your body together to get the job done. And I think in some ways, one of the ways that people use their private music right now is to get their work done in this sort of alien experience. So I think it's kind of interesting that there's a musical practice change in terms of people have become consumers of the music, and they're not producing their own music.
Well, there's history. I mean, there's interesting history. I mean, in England, for example, there's an interesting history of the pub, where predominantly working class institutions used to be on the end of streets in industrial cities, because people's houses were so small and cramped. You'd go to the pub to socialise, and that's where you would sing. And you would read newspapers, and if you couldn't read, people would read newspapers too, for example. So there's an interesting trajectory of, you know, where, you know, in the 40s, you know, jukeboxes start arriving, and then now they've gone out, but you have sound systems, etc. And so they become places not to be intimate in, or silencing other, you know. So those are, you know, there are interesting cultural histories mediated through different forms of sonic practices or not, I think.
I just wanted to take us back to the point about the desire to listen that you referred to, and I think many of us find as at least a positive aspect of this, say compared to the background music or the imposed thing where the loss of control, you know, and that sort of thing. One of the ideas of Walter Benjamin that I also really like, and I think is appropriate here, is that he, I don't know exactly how he phrased it in translation presumably, the desire to bring things closer. That media bring things closer. And, you know, with music, I'm not sure exactly which he was thinking about.
Work of art in the age mechanical.
Yeah, but which things to bring closer. But, you know, music itself, you know, that it happens to be played live in an environment and then is played for you through loudspeakers. None of that really brings you anywhere near as close as Walkman, iPod, the headphone listening where you're almost essentially, one with in fact, it becomes the environment. And I wondered if that was reflected in some of your informants or what you thought about that, and you've kind of implied a little bit that maybe the iPhone is going to take us away from that by reverting us back with all sorts of other flight things. This sense of becoming close, and of course potentially addicted, which I think you've also implied there.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of listening, lots of users say they bring out, every time they hear the certain songs, they feel they hear something new or different, and it allows for that. So I kind of think that's potentially quite sophisticated, actually, and very few mentioned fidelity though. I thought sound quality would be significant. Almost nobody mentioned it, and which surprised me. So they weren't concerned that whatever. So that tells us maybe something about it, listening. The Walter Benjamin thing is you can extend it to sound. I mean, he's talking about visual things and the film and being able to. It's like the optical unconscious, isn't it? I found it interesting. I mean, it's a bit naughty, but in that article he doesn't mention sound, and it's interesting because he's writing it a few years after the introduction of sound in film, and he does have this notion of propaganda. But in fact, it was Goebbels who at the time was pointing to the role of sound in film as a propaganda device. And Benjamin doesn't mention it. But anyway, he mentions sound other places. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, in the broader way, where I think Benjamin's really interesting when he talks about, kind of the, cultivating, training the sensorium, for example. Through technology, that that's a nice concept through which to look at this stuff and the very closeness. Barclays that sounds are as close to us as our thoughts. It becomes a manifestation of that. The unmediated mediation has also got a philosophical background, which goes back to Bishop Berkeley and that empiricism, where the only things that are real are the things that are on your retina. So it's an idealism where nothing exists beyond your retina. So in fact, so the idea of mediation, mediated experience through the retina itself, is taken as unmediated. And so there's a philosophical trajectory, I think, to the experiential categories that we operate through the technology now, which is also really interesting. If you're looking at strands that you thought that might explain how we explain stuff. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just wondering, you had any comments about, because using headphones, everyone can privatize their own space. It was interesting, I thought, with the use of, even on iPads now, they have equalizers, and everyone can become their own DJ for all intended purposes. I wonder, that creative aspect, is, what is it doing to our spaces?
Well, I don't know if it's that radical. I mean, I got invited to an iPod party a few years ago, and in my own jaundiced way, I thought what would happen is that what happens is you get 10 minutes, each person gets 10 minutes. And I thought what would happen is everybody would have their favourite song, and that's what they would do. But in fact, it wasn't like that at all. It appeared that people were listening to what the previous song was and would find something that would follow on from it. So it was much more collaborative. So that was, you know. But they also have things. When I did the Walkman thing, I had this thought that what would it be like to put people in a room and they all have their own dance music. What would that look like? And I didn't do it because I thought this was like unscrupulous and whatever. And now people go to clubs to do that as voluntarily, you know, so that you have a. So there's a kind of distance, you know, how things become normalised. But I think the underlying question is that it obviously can open up ways of social you know, people sharing music. What you were talking about before, you know, like getting together in a bar, swapping your music, you know, working, or people doing, you know, so I'll put this music on for you, you do whatever. There's lots of social bits to it, yeah. I think the issue is, I suppose, that you know, and it's mirrored by mobile phone use, where we're organising to meet specific people at endpoints, for example, yeah, and that's all well and good. And there is a thing, but what happens to the space in between, you know? And it's like with mobile phone use, you know, you warm up the space of habitation through the conversation with an absent other, you know, and you're gesticulating at the same time. But the space around that warmth becomes colder. The social space becomes colder as a collective space, you know. And that's I kind of think what happens, but it's not to deny the desire for connectivity, warmth, and the social things, because they are there. It's how they manifest themselves through the use of the technology that's interesting, I think.
Although in recording, the musician is also the absent of it.
Yes. So it's a slightly different. I mean, it's interesting with collaboration, isn't it? Where you don't meet the person collaborating that you're.
And you do it online.
Yeah. But I think it's an interesting research topic to see how, in what sense that becomes embodied in it cognitively. That's a good one. That's a good one to do.
So I think we have time for one more question.
We got.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about more voyeuristic forms of mobile sharing, I guess, listening? And what I mean by that is, for example, Audioboo. Audioboo is, I know, popular in Europe. But Audioboo is, and there's others like it, but let's say, you know, Audioboo is a little bit more popular. And it's just, you can go on your mobile phone, it will show you recordings near you. So it'll actually locate you, sort of, and you can listen to whatever people recorded. And I've listened to, you know, strangers that just talked about the duck that they just saw in the pond, and they say where they are. They record a little bit of it, and they said, "This is what a beautiful day. I just wanted to say," you know, and there's a real voyeuristic pleasure there to listen to an ordinary person or a complete stranger. And then the other thing that I wanted to say, one of the most satisfying listening experiences for me lately was, you know, sorry for the too much information, but I went I was in my house, I took a bath, and I listened to, again on my mobile phone, the police scanner. The police from an LA precinct, and it told me how many people were also listening to that at the time. But it's a real-time police scanner. And it was this totally interesting experience, just being in my house completely alone and listening and like waiting to hear what's going to happen next.
Well, I think, yeah. I think it's okay. Out of the
Sorry to introduce these other
No. I think there's something else there. That's not particularly about sound. I don't think it's about. It can be, but I think it's like there is that notion of spectacle
It's voyeuristic for sure.
But most media is voyeuristic, actually, if you think
Yeah.
about it.
Or audioristic.
I think, but you know, it's kind of equivalent to Twitter and I suppose I'm not going to say the minutiae or the triviality of stuff, but there is something interesting, I suppose, about if you think of the new, you know, the police thing. And I kind of think, to some extent, as academics, we'll talk about this tomorrow as well, it's very strange what one does with other people's sounds. And the study, things like the archive, or what is it, you know, and there's also some voyeurism there, I think. And sometimes when I'm working, I'm thinking, well, why am I really listening to this? And I've been listening to some lots of gruesome things just recently as part of a research project. And it goes back to things like, you know, the collecting of sounds of, you know, if you look at the anthropologists from the turn of the century, listening to the sounds of, you know, dying races and songs, and it's archived, it's decontextualized from its physical environment. But there's something about the spectral sound which is enticing about it. And so, you know, maybe as academics are also involved in this, and we portray it as much more meaningful than the duck in the. But there's another. I was in Berlin, and these people won this award for. It was kind of like a network where you could, if you joined other people, and you would say, for example, you were going to Safeways here, Safeways, and somebody else could see that you were going to Safeways, and they might think, oh, I'll meet you and have a cup of tea or something, yeah. And I kind of said, and they won this award for this design, and I said, well, what happens if someone's being stalked? Can you switch it off? They said, no, we haven't worked out how to do that. And so there's a kind of the positive gloss. I mean, there's interesting. I met with this guy who developed a piece of technology that could change your ringtone without you knowing it. So what would happen is, say for example, I wanted to phone you up, and I had this favourite song, and I said, well, this would allow me to put, when I phoned you, to put my song on your thing, and then you could buy it. He hadn't been allowed to market it, but you know, so there's lots. The dark side of the stuff is interesting as well, you know, and so in one sense the duck in the park is innocent, but you can twist it around to make it not so innocent, actually, I think, but yeah, I mean, that notion of voyeurism, most voyeuristic, and also we internalise voyeurism. You know, in England, for example, you know, we have more surveillance cameras per head of population than anywhere else in the world. And even in places where no one lives. so that's quite interesting in terms of that notion of wishing to be seen as well. You know,
yeah, I mean, I think it's a desire for connection.
Yeah, maybe.
In some way, I think so.
Yeah, maybe. What kind of connection is that?
Indeed.
Okay, are we done?
Thank you. Yes, we're over time.
That's all right.
Thank you so much.